So, For the Win is my new book. It's about gold farming. Gold farming is a thing that people do in video games. They will undertake to do a repetitive task like killing gimpy monsters or digging for ore or shearing sheep and making shirts out of them. And the money that they get for this in the game, the gold, the swords, the armor, the spaceships, the laser guns, they sell to other players who are either too lazy or too short on time to do these tasks themselves. It's formally considered cheating, but there's about 400,000 people who do it for a living right now. Most of the people who do the farming live in the poor world. Most of the people who do the buying live in the rich world. And For the Win is a novel about what happens when the farmers unionize. And they're able to unionize in places where independent trade unions are illegal because they're all in a video game together where their employers can't spy on them or stop them. And so this gives them an enormous advantage. They have a second advantage, which is that they're young and their employers are old, and they're using network technology, and their employers aren't as good at using those technologies as they are. So that's the setup. I'm going to read to you a scene that describes the breakout of the first Wildcat strike. I'll say in advance there are some Chinese words in the scene because it's set in South China. The book is set in South China, India, Indonesia, Singapore, and Orange County. And Atlanta a little. And this scene is set in South China. I don't speak Chinese. Traveling in China to research the book convinced me that I really, really don't speak Chinese. I will mispronounce the Chinese words in this. I apologize in advance. My pronunciations are not canonical. Ling had just finished 12 hours of gold farming and had ordered in a tray of pork dumplings and doused them in hot Vietnamese red rooster sauce and chopstick them into his mouth as fast as he could chew, and now he was ready to relax with some after-work play. For this, he always used his own tune, a char he'd started playing with when he was a boy in Gansu. In some ways, this tune was him. So long had he lived with it, lovingly buffing it, training it, dressing it in the rarest of treasures. He had trained up innumerable tunes and seen them sold off, but this one was him. Tonight, Ling partied with farmers he knew from other parts of China, some of whom he'd known back in the village and some of whom he'd never met in the flesh. They were a ferocious nightly raiding guild, and they pulled off the hardest missions in all the worlds. Word had gotten around, and now every night he had an audience of players who'd just been hired on, watching in awe as he kicked fantastic quantities of ass. He loved that. Loved answering their questions when he was done playing, helping the whole team get better, and you know, they loved him too, and that was just great. So they ran Buri's fortress, the palace of a long-departed god, the father of the gods, the powerful elemental force that had birthed Svartalfheim warriors in the universe in which the game lay. It had fearsome guardians, required powerful spells just to reach, and had never been fully run in the history of the game. It was just the sort of mission that Ling loved to try. This would be his sixth crack at it, and he was prepared to raid for 6 hours straight, if that was what it took. And then he got Fenrir's Tooth. It was the rarest and most legendary drop in all of Svartalfheim warriors, a powerful talisman that would turn any wolf pack or enthrall them to the tooth's holder. The message boards had been full of talk about it, and several times there had been fraudulent auctions for it, but no one had ever truly seen it before. After Ling picked it up, it had come from an epic battle with an army of sky giants in which the entire raiding party had been killed over and over again. He was so stunned by it that he couldn't speak for a moment, just pointed at a screen while his mouth opened and shut. The players watching him fell silent too, following his gaze and his finger, slowly realizing what had just happened. A murmur built through the crowd, picking up steam, picking up volume, turning into a roar, a triumphant shout that brought the entire cafe over to see. Over the computer fans' noise, they buzzed excitedly, a hormone-drenched, triumphant tribal chest-beating exercise that swept them all up. Every boy imagined what it would be like to go questing with Fenrir's Tooth. Every boy's heart thundered in his chest. But there was another sound, getting louder and more insistent, an older voice, raspy with a million cigarettes, a hard voice. Sit down, back to work, everyone back to work. It was Wang, the foreman, shouting in his fearsome Fujianese accent. He was rumored to be an ex-snakehead thrown out of the human smuggling gang for killing migrants with his rough treatment. Usually he sat lizard-like and motionless in the corner, smoking a succession of cheap Chinese Class D fake Marlboros, a lazy curl of smoke giving him a permanent squint on one side of his face. Sometimes players would forget that he was there. and their horseplay and laughter would get a little out of control, and he would steal up behind them on cat-silent feet and deliver a ringing blow to the side of the head that would send them reeling. It was enough of an object lesson, don't piss off the snakehead or he'll lay a beating on you, but he hardly ever had to repeat it. Now, though, he was clouting boys left and right, bellowing orders in his loud, hoarse voice. The boys retreated to their computers in a shoving rush, leaving Reeling alone in his seat, an uncertain smile on his face. "Boss," he said, "you see what I've done?" He pointed to the screen. Wang's face was as impassive as ever. He put a hard, heavy hand on Reeling's shoulder and leaned in to read the screen, his head wreathed in smoke. Finally, he straightened. "Fenrir's tooth," he said. He nodded. "A bonus for you, Reeling. Very good." Reeling shrank back. "Boss," he said, respectfully, speaking loudly to be heard over the computer fans. "Boss, that is my character. I'm not working now. I'm on my personal time. That's my character." Wang turned to look at him, his eyes hard and his expression flat. "A bonus," he said again. "Well done." "It's my character," Reeling said, speaking more loudly. "No bonus, it's mine. I earned it personally on my own time." He didn't even see the blow, it was that fast. 1 minute he was hotly declaring that Fenrir's tooth was his, the next he was sprawled on his ass with his head ringing like a gong. The foreman put one foot on his throat. The man said, "No bonus," clearly and distinctly so that everyone around could hear. Then he hawked up a huge mouthful of poisonous green spit from the tar-soaked depths of his blackened lungs and carefully spat it in Reeling's face. From the age of 4, Reeling had practiced wushu, training with a man in the village whom all the adults deferred to. The man had been sent north during the Cultural Revolution, denounced and beaten and starved, but he'd never broken. He was as gentle and patient as a grandmother, and he was as old as the hills, and he could send an attacker flying through the air with one flick of the wrist, break a board with his old hands, kick you into the next life with one ancient, gnarled foot. For 12 years, Reeling had gone 3 times a week to train with the old man. All the boys had. It had just been part of life in the village. He hadn't practiced since he came to South China, had all but forgotten that relic of a different land. But now he remembered every lesson, remembered it deep in his muscles. He gripped the ankle of the foot that was on his throat, twisted just slightly to gain maximum leverage, and applied a small controlled bit of pressure and threw the foreman into the air, sending him sailing in a perfect, graceful arc that terminated when his head cracked against the side of one of the long trestle tables, knocking it over and sending a dozen flat screens tumbling to the ground, the crash audible over the computer fans. Reeling stood carefully and faced the foreman. The man was groaning on the ground, and Reeling couldn't keep the small grin off his face. That had felt good. He found that he was standing in a ready stance, his weight balanced evenly on each foot, feet spread for stability, body side on to the man on the ground, presenting a smaller target. His hands were loosely held before him, one before the other, ready to catch a punch and lock the arm and throw the attacker, ready to counterstrike high or low. The boys around him were cheering, chanting his name, and Reeling smiled more broadly. The foreman picked himself up off the floor, no expression at all on his face, a terrible blankness, and Reeling felt his first inkling of fear. Something about how the man held himself as he stood, not anything like the stance in the martial arts games they played in the village, something altogether more serious. Reeling heard a high, whining noise and realized it was coming from his own throat. He lowered his hand slightly, extended one in a friendly, palm-up way. "Come on now," he said. "Let's be adults about this." And that's when the foreman reached under the shoulder of his ill-fitting, rumpled, dander-speckled suit jacket and pulled out a cheap little pistol, pointed it at Reeling, and shot him square in the forehead. Even before Reeling hit the ground, one eye open, the other shut, the boys around him began to roar. The foreman had 1 second to register the sound of 100 voices rising in anger before the boys boiled over, clambering over one another to reach him. Too late, he tried to tighten his finger on the trigger of the gun he'd carried ever since leaving behind Fujian province all those years before. But by then, 3 boys had fastened themselves to his arm and forced it down so that the gun was aiming into the meat of his old thigh, and the .22 slug he squeezed off drilled itself into the big femur before flattening on the shattered bone, spreading out like a lead coin. When he opened his mouth to scream, fingers found their way into his cheeks, viciously tearing at them, even as other hands, twined themselves in his hair, fastened themselves to his feet and arms, even yanked at his ears. Someone punched him hard in the balls twice, and he couldn't breathe around the hands in his mouth, couldn't scream as he tumbled down. The gun was wrenched out of his hand at the same instant that two fists drilled into his eyes, and then it was dark and painful and infinite, a moment that stretched off into his unconsciousness and then into annihilation. So thank you, that's the reading. So it's a novel about union organizing, it's a novel about economics, it's a novel about games, and it's a novel about behavioral economics and globalism. And it's mostly for young adults, which is to say that it's appropriate for young adults and adults as well. The big difference between an adult book and a young adult book is if you pick up an adult book and you find material in it that's inappropriate for an adolescent, you have no one to blame but yourself. Whereas if you pick up a young adult book, you'll find material that's appropriate for adolescents and adults as well. So it's a young adult book in that sense, and it tries to do with subjects like macroeconomics and complex derivatives what Little Brother did with cryptography. And so it uses things like game gold to describe the mechanisms by which credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations work, for example. So that's the book. Like all of them, it's a free download. It's also available for sale here, thanks to the nice folks at Tor. And I'll take any questions you have. No? Yes? Maybe? I'll just stand here looking dumb. Yeah?
For the research for the book, you spoke to actual gold farmers?
I did. I spoke to gold farmers, and I spoke to people who ran gold farms, and I spoke to experts who studied gold farms, academics. The interesting thing about all this is that I heard numerous first and second-hand accounts, like primary and secondary accounts of gold farms, including those in the academic press, and the financial press, and popular press, and they were all contradictory, right, and exclusive. Right? They couldn't all be true. What I realized as this kind of proceeded is that people weren't lying, that gold farming is a secret, right? The way that gold farms work is not shared with other gold farms, so everybody does it a different way. In India, they talk about industries being organized and not organized, and it took me a while to get a sense of what that means. And an organized industry is one in which it's been organized. Someone's gone around and said, that works, that's dumb, do more of this, less of that, people want to buy this, stop making that. That's what organized is. We actually don't have many disorganized industries here. It's hard to think of them. Even drug dealing, which is another black market activity, there's enough porosity of information between people who do it, I guess partly because it's just been around longer maybe, that it feels like best practices have emerged. Like, there are local variations, but basically, buying a twist of something is pretty much the same everywhere, Yeah.
How do you account for the difference between games like World of Warcraft and something like Second Life, which obviously there's in-game economics, but they shake out very, very differently?
Well, I think it comes back to what I was talking about before the reading, that this inherent authoritarianism in games. So one of the things that makes games fun and difficult is that they are authoritarian, right? There's, in the same way that like a comedian decides when you're going to hear the punchline, you don't get a vote. And actually, like, trying to short-circuit the punchline isn't like a legitimate form of protest. It's just a dick move. Shouting out the punchline from the audience, not considered like a part of the movement to democratize comedy. In the same way, games have this authoritarian streak in them, right? They decide when you're going to get the gold and how, and what it's going to take to do it, and how long you're going to have to grind and do all these other things. And actually, it seems like Warcraft ties into, along with a lot of other games, ties into this disconnection we have between our limbic and our hedonic reward systems, where we get some reward for doing things that our body craves, and some reward for doing things that our mind finds like chewy and crunchy at the same time. So, you can sit there, for example, you can sit there at your computer for 12 hours playing WoW and not even notice that your entire, your sciatic nerve is on fire from your third lumbar vertebra to the bottom of your feet until you stop, right? There's a hedonic reward system that's totally disconnected from your limbic reward system. And vice versa, you can sit there jamming cigarettes into your gob and going, God, I hate these things, while your body goes, oh, more cigarettes, right? Or more carbohydrates or whatever. So WoW seems to do this kind of very clever, and I think not systematic. Like, I don't think anyone ever sat down and said, let's stick someone's head in an fMRI and see how it looks when they kill orcs, right? But I think that they should, yeah. But I think that what did happen was kind of by accident and by a Darwinian winnowing away of those things that didn't compel players as much, is they come up with this formula for fun that partly involves doing things that are like really authoritatively and clearly not fun, grinding, right? Doing repetitive tasks for a long time. And it seems like going on an epic quest with a thing that you had to do a bunch of meaningless, horrible drudge work to get to makes the epicness more epic, right? In the same way that like beating your head against the wall feels good when you stop, going on a really cool quest after you've been grinding for 16 hours feels even better than going on a really cool quest without it. So Second Life doesn't have that mechanic. It has lots of games inside of it. People have done really cool things in SL. They've built, basically like miniature Quakes and all kinds of other games inside SL that aren't, that aren't Second Life, that are like games you play within it. But it doesn't have that same compulsion. Second Life is really interesting. I like dipping my toe in it every now and again and having a look around. The thing that Second Life reminds me of more than anything is an old text messaging system called The Well, which is still around. It started by the people who started the Whole Earth catalogs and the Whole Earth review. It was called the Whole Earth Electronic Link. It was a global chat system that debuted in the mid-'80s. It's not as old as Plato, which I think is 40 years old this week, but it's still pretty old. And everything that ever happened on the internet that was newsworthy happened in some microcosm on The Well. When it had 5,000 people. It was like the tiny microcosm that predicted the entire future history of the internet. Kill files and trolling and like it had its own D. Like it had all of it. There's a 4chan analog and all of that stuff actually all happened on The Well first. Except The Well never grew beyond about 5,000 people and is now in decline. Even though if all the people who went on to do many of the people who went on to do really interesting things started on The Well. Wired was started on The Well. The EFF was started on The Well. The local equivalent here would be Panix, which I think had a lot of the same history. And so that's what SL reminds me of. All the weird, interesting, chewy, meaty things that will arise in a virtual world have arisen somewhere in SL, or probably will, but I have a hard time imagining it growing to 11 million players like WoW, or probably the next one will be 100 million players because they're growing up by orders of magnitude. And I have an even harder time imagining that. Yeah?
Do you have recommendations for the game companies themselves? Do they have some kind of moral obligation in relation to these third world jobs they could be creating, or just...
Well, I guess my advice to game companies would be to acknowledge the fact that sticking grinding in a game guarantees that you'll get farmers, right? To the extent that the gameplay depends partly on doing things that are materially unpleasant and tedious, there will be other players who will seek to buy their way out of the tedium. And some games have monetized this, right? There are all these pay-to-play, real money trade games where they essentially take two different audiences. They have time-rich, cash-poor teenagers who will grind all day to acquire epic items, and they have time-poor, cash-rich adults who will buy them from the teenagers in a sanctioned game exchange that they take some skim out of, that they get to play intermediary in. And some games have figured out how to just be grinding quests, right? I mean, if you want to talk about a game that's all limbic, no hedonic, look at Farmville, right? There's no fun in Farmville. Farmville is grind quest. Right? It's like the reason to level up in Farmville is so you can level up again in Farmville. It's grinding without any missions. Even the social part, which it's the extent to which you have other people who are your pals in this social network in your farm, they're not really there. It's as though they've stuck a cardboard cutout of themselves there. They don't actually get to actually do stuff with you in the game. And I think that's one of the other things that makes both SL and WoW and the internet really compelling is that the oldest game we play is the how do we get other people to do stuff with us game, right? It's the game that we invented the neocortex for when we stopped being solo monkeys and started being groups of monkeys, and then we had to start figuring out which monkeys were actually like doing the job that we became tribal for, which is, you watch the kids all gather the fruit, and which ones are sleeping under a tree while someone else watches the kids and gathers the fruit, right? So that game is like incredibly satisfying to our brains. We have a big wrapper around our brain, the neocortex, the new bark, that just sits there and counts up social relationships and monitors them and tries to figure out what's going on. And Farmville has figured out how to tickle even that without involving any real people, right? It's like they perfectly denatured all the things that are good about games and left behind just the part that's compelling without being fun. It's a strange and creepy thing, really.
So how do these companies advertise the farmers? I remember a couple years ago there's an event with the gnomes being dropped.
Yeah, so the way the companies advertise is really fraught, obviously, because there's only so much standing in a busy square that you can do, shouting, gold, gold, get your fresh gold here, like Chico Marx, right? Get you ice cream, tootsie ice cream. There's only so much that you can do before someone calls the moderator over and says, that guy's a cheater, right? And they terminate your account. Now, in a game that's free to create trial accounts in, you just create another one, right? You're just sitting there broadcasting a URL for a while. But as you mentioned, some of the cleverer ways of doing it are to kill a bunch of gimpy monsters and arrange them in your URL, right? Because that's a lot harder for the game to automatically detect. But really, I think the major way is Google AdWords, the same way everyone else advertises specialist things, right? If you go search for wild gold, and you'll find 16 gold farmers, right? Because it's not illegal to be a gold farmer. It's against terms of service to be a gold farmer, right? It's like there are ballparks that don't let you bring in your own water, but that doesn't mean that Google will turn down ads for those things that let you hide water in a fake belly. It's not Google's problem if somewhere there's a ballpark with a crazy term of service, right?
In Florida, you talk about the profession Turks, the Turks, and I was wondering if that came from any specific inspiration or if that was on your own devising, where that came from, and because it seems like something that makes sense in terms of the evolution of gaming, and I was just wondering where.
That was just speculative. So in the book in reality there's a thing called the Mechanical Turk that Amazon runs, and it's a way of apportioning and accomplishing piecework. So a pretty interesting early example was there was a rich guy who went missing on a boat, and they had all these satellite photos of the ocean. And in one of those satellite photos, there may or may not have been a picture of his boat, and they wanted to figure out where it was. So they told the Mechanical Turk, which is just a bunch of people who agree to do spot work if it suits them at a rate that is offered by people who come to this kind of job market. They said, we'll pay you a penny for every satellite photo you look at and see if there's a boat in it. And so Mechanical Turks, looked at millions and millions of photos of these things to kind of add up a bunch of money. So in my book, and for the win, the Mechanical Turks get work as spot referees in games. So when you do something that game developers never bothered to program in, like you stick your sword in a pumpkin, or you knock through a wall that actually doesn't have a room behind it, or you say something to a non-player character that the non-player character doesn't know what to do about, it finds a Mechanical Turk, bids the job out to them in a millisecond, and the Mechanical Turk comes along and says, well, you stick it in a pumpkin, it makes this sound, or behind this wall is that room from this map over here, or takes on and writes their own hokey dialogue for the non-player character you started speaking to, kind of busts out the full-on Ren Fair, prithee good sir, what dost thou wishest of me? And it makes the game feel realer, right? I mean, games are really interesting in that, when compared to other kind of immersive environments, like when you go to a movie, there's a really big screen and it's black on the edges. And you kind of feel like you're in it, right? That's why big screens are cool. It kind of feels like you're there. There's not a lot of distraction around it. It's why it's crappy when people talk on their phones or whatever. In a game, you've got extruded Tolkien product in a screen about this big, and then around it is like the most disjoint thing you can imagine. It's chrome, right? And then next to the chrome is your apartment. So, and nevertheless, it can feel pretty realistic, right? And that if not realistic, it can feel, what's the word I'm looking for? It can feel convincingly, interestingly complete, right? Like there's a there. And this helps you feel like there's some more there. And it wouldn't be very expensive because, of course, there's lots of piecework, people who want to do piecework out there. And that's PIEC, not PEAC. And I thought the Turks would make a really nice counterpart to the gold farmers, because gold farmers are also piece workers working in the game to kind of accomplish some objective, but it's one that runs contrary to the interests of the farmers, of the game runners, rather. Yeah?
Do you think that gold farming might improve a game's success rather than hinder it? Which, like WoW seems to think that gold farming hurts their game, but do you think it actually improves the game's success?
Well, there are games that are designed to enlist gold farmers, essentially, these real money trade games that are built around it. There's some problems with gold farming from the perspective of game economics, right? So first of all, there's the fact that economists who work for games companies tend to be really control freaky, right? Because, it's a little like sociologists who study social networks. You go through your entire life feeling inferior because you come from a soft science where you can't count things, and then all of a sudden suddenly you can be a physicist of the human relationship by counting up the links between people on Facebook and go, there's a social graph, we've got math, right? In the same way, economists, right? They sit there for, it's hard to be an experimental economist, right? I mean, even games like. Even famous economics experiments like the Ultimatum game is a classic, amazing behavioral economics experiment where you get two players. One's the offerer, one's the acceptor, and you give the offerer 100 pennies, and you say you can give as many or as few of these pennies as you'd like to the acceptor, and if the acceptor accepts them, you each keep your stake, and if the acceptor doesn't, neither of you gets anything. And neoclassical economics predicts that the offerer will slide 1 penny across the table because that way the other person will have 1 penny more than she would have otherwise, and she'll accept that because she's a rational actor, and he'll get to keep his 99 pennies. And what actually happens is most of the time the offerer slides about half of his pennies across the table, and the acceptor, unless there's about half of the pennies being slid across, walks away from the offer and is willing to give up 50 cents to punish this guy for being a jerk. So one of the big questions about the behavior game, and there's an exception to this, which is that if you've gone to Econ 101 class and been told that you should act like a jerk, you do, which is pretty funny. One of the big open questions about this is, to what extent is this willingness to punish people for being unfair about the fact that the stakes are 50 cents, right? What if the stakes were $500,000? What if I said, here's like $1 billion in $1 million increments, and you can give as many or as few of your $1 million increments to this other person, and if they don't accept it, they walk away. And I slide a paltry 1 million over to you. Would you still punish me and walk away from your $1 million? The problem is that's a really hard experiment to conduct. It's expensive, right? So economists don't get to be experimental very often, but they do in virtual worlds, right? It's all of a sudden something that used to be very soft and very Gertzian and very anthropological and was really about like looking at people and what they did and making up stories to explain their behaviors and then trying to predict it and looking back at the data and seeing whether or not it worked that way. All of a sudden you can formulate an economic theory and write a user license that says if you fail to abide by my economic theory, your account is terminated, and then you can just terminate all the people who fail to act in the way that your theory predicts, right? And so that's the first problem, is that economists just hate the idea that there are people doing things in the economy that don't work in the theoretical framework that they've used to develop the parameters of the economy, the physics of the economy. It's not just gold farmers, right? And notoriously, EverQuest was one of the first games to try to have something that looked like an economy with inputs and outputs. So they had inverse relationships between commodities and finished products. And you would make finished products out of commodities in order to gain points in the game. So one of the things you do is turn sheep into shirts. You'd shear a sheep and make a shirt. And the more shirts there were in the game, the fewer sheep there were. And as you wore a shirt, it would deteriorate. And when it fell apart, they'd make another sheep somewhere. So this is kind of a cool, interesting dynamic. They didn't reckon on a player with OCD who just crafted shirts all day and never wore them. And he filled his little game house with shirts until there were no more sheep in the game, right? So, people behave erratically already. Now, the reason that's really freaky is that the value of game gold is directly tied to how fun the game is, not how productive it is, right? So, there are lots of countries on this planet that are less fun than others, right? I mean, for example, Singapore has lots of fun things in it, but on the grand scale of funness, it's probably pretty low down, but the Singaporean dollar is worth quite a lot of money because it's a very productive economy. In a game, if a game stops being fun and everybody leaves, or if another game is more fun and everybody leaves, the value of all the objects in that game crashes. All your savings crash, everything crashes. It's like what happened when they turned lights on in Warcraft and everybody left Star Wars Galaxies so quickly you could actually hear, the sucking sound of all the lightsabers popping out of existence, right? And so one of the things that the economies are managed for in games is to make the games fun. When the games stop being fun because someone's doing something in the economy that doesn't make sense, then the economy crashes, the game stops working. So it is a delicate balance. I think that the kind of the inevitable kind of dramatic reality of games is that there will be farmers if there is grinding. So I don't know how the economists are going to manage that, but they're going to have to figure it out. Yeah.
Do you think the farmers like playing the game?
Some of them do, yeah. That's really clear that some farmers really like playing the game. I mean, this is the other kind of crunchy and chewy issue about gold farming, is the extent to which it's a kind of reflection of a lot of other debates about legitimacy and interest. So farmers, some of them will say, I play for 12 hours a day, and that makes me a good player, right? I pay for my account, I play all day, I'm really good at the game, I know it backwards and forwards, I know its lore, I know all of its insides and outs, I know how to maneuver the game very quickly, I'm very good at it, so I'm a player too, right? And in fact, some of them, when they finish playing, they relax by playing some more, right? 12 hours on, 6 hours more playing, 6 hours sleep, get up, play some more games. That's not an uncommon pattern among gamers, among gold farmers. So then you have the real players from the rich world who go around player killing gold farmers, or harassing them, or shouting racist epithets at them, or whatever. And those people say, no, we're the legitimate players, right? We pay, and we have the legitimate stake, and you are undermining the value of our play. To which the gold farmer might say, well, yeah, but if I don't play, I don't eat, right? You can take it or leave it, right? Who's got more of a stake in it? The guy whose living depends on it, or the person who just does it because they want to unwind for a few hours? And then you have the game runners who say, actually, neither of you belong here, except to the extent that we suffer you to be here, and you both agreed to that when you clicked through 7,000 words of license agreement when you logged on. You agree to it every day, that you don't have any legitimate stake to it. You have acknowledged it in our freely negotiated contract that runs, to thousands and thousands of words that you have to scroll through and click I agree on every time you log into that game. So this is an interesting kind of microcosm for a lot of other legitimacy claims. So like one is a labor claim, right? You put the money into the shop, I put the work into the shop. Who are you to say that your stake is more important than my stake? Right? That's a debate we've been having for like 150 years. There are other debates. You put these characters into my head, they're now part of my culture. Who are you to say I'm not allowed to write about them, or act them out, or make videos about them, or make fan art about them, right? We have all of these legitimacy questions, and they're all fraught, right? Questions like, your family got here 2 generations ago, and my family got here 5 generations ago. What makes you say that you can be a real denizen of this place and I'm not, or vice versa? In England, we have the British National Party, who are Nazis. Not Nazis like, I disagree with you, so I'm going to call you a Nazi, but Nazis like, they're Nazis. And they have this crazy thing about deporting people who are not of, I can't even remember the words, but it is one of these really crazy things, people who are not of indigenous English ethnic origin or something, right? By which they mean like a kind of mongrel melange of Normans, Celts, Welsh, Yorkshiremen, whatever, right? All these different people who variously conquered England over the centuries. And it's like, well, their claims are legitimate, but your claims are not. And in particular, one of the things that they think is not a legitimate claim is, you conquered my country and took all of its resources and got very rich off of it, so I'd like to come here and live here for a while. And they think that claim is totally illegitimate. I think that there's pretty good reason to suggest that it's pretty legitimate, actually. So, these are the kinds of really chewy social problems that we have that are reflected in games and that emerge from questions like, do gold farmers like to play? Aren't you glad you asked? How are we doing? All right. Yeah.
As a writer, when you're talking about these social concerns, or like you're talking about how this book can be seen as like educating about economics or whatever your concerns are, and a lot of your books, how do you balance that against just like narrative and pleasure, and just like artistic creativity?
I think one of the things that makes narrative exciting is when it feels like you are, it has become a frame through which the world can be viewed and come into focus in a way that you hadn't before you started reading. It's one of the things that really can make pleasure reading very, very compelling, at least for me. I think that this is why we like, vintage Heinlein, right? Is that reading Heinlein sometimes felt like someone quite nice, sidling up and putting their arm around your shoulder and going, look kid, I'm going to explain how the world works, right? And I'm going to do it through a series of stories. I like that, and I try to make that happen. It's a taste thing. There are some people who really don't like that. One of the nice things about my books is you can never say, well, I had to buy it to discover that I didn't like it. You can read all my books for free over the interwebs and then decide whether or not you want to buy them. So there's another question over here somewhere, I thought.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So to the extent that humans are social animals, and if these gold farmers are spending so much of their lives sort of working through the mediation machine, is that really sort of transhumanism, or is that missing the point entirely?
Is it transhumanist for them to be working in a virtual world? I don't know. I think that transhumanism has got a bit of hubris in it, because it says that all those other really transformative technologies were not transformative the way that our transformative technology is, which seems a lot like, our innovative rock and roll music was innovative and your innovative rock and roll music is derivative. So I think that like the interstate highway system was pretty transhumanizing, right? I mean, the fact that you could kind of pick up and go somewhere else really quickly, and that moreover, that people who you didn't know would routinely come through your little town all the time with lots of weird and interesting news. That's pretty transhumanist in a pretty interesting and meaty way. So yeah, I don't know if I would call it transhumanist in that kind of Ray Kurzweil, the singularity is near, rapture of the nerds sense. Yeah.
Do you think is the impact of social networks going to be in real society?
What will be the impacts of social networks on society? Well, for what? In the future, I don't know, because I'm not good at predicting the future. But I'll say a few things about them. So one is that I think social networks, as presently construed, have two really interesting pathological characteristics. The first is that they all appear to be Skinner boxes designed to make you undervalue privacy, right? Like to just kind of use shell games to make you mispredict the consequences of privacy disclosures. And the second is that they're all optimized for disclosure. As a game, the game is always about disclosing and getting reward for it. And we have some pretty stable, long-term, compelling social networks that are based on non-disclosure, like the Freemasons, for example, hundreds if not thousands of years old, and all based on not telling people stuff about yourself. And so it seems to me that a decade ago or so, some guy put together 6 degrees and said, I guess it'll be disclosure based. And then the next person who came along with Friendster said, that worked, that disclosure thing. I wonder what variations I can come up with to make it more powerful. And we got to where we are now. But I feel like we're reaching a bit of a local maximum. Like we've kind of, how much more juice is there to extract from that particular fruit of disclosure? Have we reached the apex of it? Maybe we haven't. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in a few years we'll all be wearing hundreds of Justin Cam style cameras just pointed inward at us and tweeting the contents of our colon. But it seems to me that there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit out there in non-disclosure land that you could build a social network around, not because you're like a committed privacy activist, but because it's a way to make some money. Yeah.
One of the themes or almost recurring characters in your book is Disney parks. I just wondered if you could comment on your fascination.
My fascination with the Disney parks. There's actually a great blog called Passport to Adventure, written by a PhD candidate. I don't know her name nor what discipline she's in, because she writes under the name Foxford. But she is absolutely the single best writer about dark rides I've ever read, about theme parks I've ever read, and immersive environments. And she writes about them as in the style of very considered literary criticism, and talks about what they mean and how they work and what their tricks are and how they echo up and down through different areas of society. And I've never read anything that better summarizes what it is that tickles me about this stuff. But basically, I think the immersive environment and more specifically the dark ride are art forms. I think very few people have ever practiced them. I think that no one has practiced them and taken them more seriously than the Disney Imagineering department at one time or another. It hasn't always done it. Sometimes it's been very crass and commercial, but by and large, it's produced some very, very good examples of the form, the best so far. And I find it compelling in the same way that people find paintings compelling. And so I like writing about it because I'm really fascinated with it. And I don't think, I think a lot of us go, we look at it and we go, oh, it's kind of lowbrow, it can't be art, in the same way that we used to think about comics or science fiction. But I think that there's like real, actual, no fooling, moving art happening in dark rides. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just going back to what you had said earlier. You're very active on Twitter, and I wouldn't even really consider it a social network since it's so asymmetrical. Where do you see the future of micro-broadcasting and being able to get your message out like that going?
I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I'm embarrassingly, I don't use anything except Twitter, so I don't know anything about any of the other ones. I've logged into Identica once because a bunch of people told me it was a moral imperative to use an open system, and I started using it, and then something came up, and I've never gone back to it. Although, I think it'd be nice to use it. It looks like it kind of it gateways in and out of Twitter pretty readily. But yeah, no, I don't know. I'm sorry. I am kind of interested in the fact that Twitter has, tweets are not 140 characters anymore. There's a whole bunch of metadata that's hidden from you that travels along with it, up to 5K of metadata that travels along with each tweet in hidden fields that you can access through the API. And I'm just waiting for the first person to realize that you can stick 5,000 characters in a tweet, not 140, and maybe start, tweeting 5K messages and see what happens. Yeah?
From a science fiction point of view, and also as a fan of Disneyland and someone who's traveled a lot, what do you see happening in terms of maybe the reduction of cultural differences across borders? Maybe a Disneyfication?
Yeah, reduction in cultural differences. I sure do see it in big cities that all the high streets are the same high street now. And I was thinking about that as I walked through a bunch of nominally bohemian neighborhoods on the way from the meatpacking district to here, and saw the same stores that we have back home in London that I walk past, almost every day. It's there, and that I saw on the Novi Prospect in St. Petersburg when I visited my family there in '06. It's there. It's the same. It's one big franchise ghetto, even in the big cities. So there is that. On the other hand, there's also a lot of really interesting non-corporate cultural diffusion of interesting ideas. So there's like a network culture that may be homogenous too, but it's a lot less controlled. It's a lot more organic. It looks a lot more like say rock and roll or something, and it has lots of individual variants. And so for example, gamers all around the world share a lot of memes and funny stuff that they make in exchange, and that are like culturally localized because nobody owns them and no one can stop them from doing it. You go to France and you see people wearing gamer shirts that say DTC, which is dans ton cul, which is up your ass, or in your ass. And so it's a thing that people say to each other when they kill each other in multiplayer games in France. And it's a real kind of gamery shirt, and it's recognizably continuous with gamer culture as it exists here, but it's also very clearly French. So, I don't know, a little of this, a little of that. There's never been, in the same way that the BNP's claims about there being an indigenous British ethnicity, there's the theoretically pure, individualized, non-exchanging cultures that were never influenced by the cultures around them or distant from them. I don't think ever existed either. I think people have been, you go back, E.L. Doctorow, who's not related to me, in his book, The Creationists, the first essay is very good. It's an essay about Genesis. and how the guys who read Genesis stole it from the Babylonians, and how, so you have cultural diffusion across space and time, hundreds, thousands of years, and I guess you could say, well, wouldn't it be better if the Hebrews had made up their own creation myth? Wouldn't they be more culturally true to themselves? But it didn't seem to, to bother them. So I don't know. It's a tough question, though. Yeah.
What do you say to people who only use restrictive copyright for their work? Do you try to persuade them to use Creative Commons?
I guess, well, I don't usually go up to people and tell them what they should do, but when people ask me about it, I say, let's consider two separate issues. Let's consider a moral question, and then let's consider a technical question, right? So let's start with the technical question. The technical question is it ever going to get harder to copy stuff? Are you ever going to be plausibly able to stop people from copying your things? And I think the answer is no, right? Like, I don't think we're headed to a future in which hard drives become like less capacious and bulkier and more expensive, or networks get harder to use, or computers get slower and less efficient, or that we teach fewer people how to type, the Hurt Locker or BitTorrent into Google, right? So, in that world, like, this is kind of the reality that we're in. So then there's a moral question, right? Which is, do you think this is good or bad? What are you going to, are you willing to go around and, as the number of people swell who are doing this, because it's possible and it's also has lots of good effects that we can't deny. I mean, getting stuff for free is nice. Getting stuff in open formats is nice. Being able to share stuff, culture with other people. It's not culture if you're not sharing it. That's like a journal, right? It's only culture if other people have it too, right? So all of that stuff is nice. And so what are you going to do as people do more of that? Are you going to call them all thieves? And which brings you to a third question, which is the commercial question, which is, why would someone who you just call a thief buy anything from you? Or are you going to do? Are you going to come to grips with it? Or are you going to exit the field, which is always an option. The arts are a dumb career to pursue. There are lots of more stable, rewarding, lucrative fields than the arts, right? Don't quit your day job isn't just a cynical thing you say to someone if you don't like how they sing. It's actually bloody good advice for anyone thinking about a career in the arts. So, lots of people have exited the field. I don't think that we're in any danger of, like, art exiting the field. I did a stand-up with someone from ABC the other day, and he said, well, who will make the movies if you can't restrict copying? And I said, well, there is 29 hours of video being uploaded every minute to YouTube. How many hours of video does ABC make per minute? And he said, well, I think a lot less than 29 hours. So clearly we're getting, like, we haven't seen the shortage emerge, the putative shortage emerge. So it's different stuff. I mean, people built wee kirks instead of grand cathedrals after the Protestant Reformation, but only an idiot would say that it ended religion, right? So that's what I say. I say you've got to make your own choice, but that choice has got to, living in fantasy land and saying I will make a choice in defiance of the reality and stand here like King Canute demanding that the sea, recede is not going to do much for you. I mean, it's like if you want to spend the rest of your life flipping burgers and being bitter about the arts, by all means, but if you want to actually be entrepreneurial about this and actually be a business person in the arts, which is the only reason to actually have this question. If you just want to make art and you don't have any commercial motivations, it shouldn't matter at all. But if you're doing this because you have a commercial motive as well, you have to attend to commercial realities. Like that's what it is to be commercial. And then I think that's our last question, and then I'll sign. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, relating to the last two questions, the homogenization of retail and taking it onto networks. Saw an interview with Mark Anderson a couple of weeks ago where he said that the end-to-end principle is dead, basically, and that because the way that the whole thing's going is the massive intermediaries, like the game people, like the YouTube, so who then control the media, and so people actually talking to each other is on the downswing. What do you think about that trend?
I don't think that YouTube or a game company are inimical to the end-to-end principle. The end-to-end principle is one of the foundational principles of the internet's design. It says that any two people should be able to communicate with one another without permission or interference from a third party. And although I can see that having centralized areas like YouTube, if they decided to be kind of jerks about it, would make it hard to use YouTube. it doesn't make it hard to use something that's not YouTube. The only thing that makes it hard, that jeopardizes the intent principle, is network providers who start to mess around with your connectivity. So for
copyright.
Yeah, because of copyright, because they want to suck up to some companies and not others, because they yearn for the days in which the network services were provided on a piecemeal basis, where every mouse click cost you some money. So, do you remember when caller ID was rolled out? Do you remember that they charged money for it? They essentially, if this was email, it would be like charging money to see the from line, right? So there was a time in which like every service was monetizable, right? Where there was a difference between a long distance and a local phone call. And we still see this in telecoms. There's a lot of phone companies that charge extra for a long distance SMS, right? This is a bizarre idea. Imagine paying for long distance email, right? So there are lots of motives for doing it. And one of the things that's fictional in this book is that there are gold farmers in India. And there's a reason there's no gold farmers in India, and that's because they have the worst telecoms regulators in the country, which means that they have virtually no big network games in India. Because the telecoms regulators allow the ISPs to say, every click is metered, right? You only get so many bytes per month. Beyond that, we charge a huge fortune. However, if anyone out there wants to launch a service that isn't in the metered universe, just come to us and pay us some money. Pay us a bribe and we'll let you reach our customers. And so there's one company, India Games, they seem like very nice people, and they have the list of games that you can play without using up all your bandwidth and knocking yourself offline for the rest of the month. And everyone else is out, right? So there's one MMO in India Games catalog, or there was as of 2008 when I was out there looking at them. And so that's what the network looks like in a non-neutral context. Craig Newmark from Craigslist, he described it like this: you pick up the phone, you call your pizzeria, and it's Joe's Pizzeria down in the corner, and they say, and the message comes on and says, AT&T, Joe's Pizzeria, there's no one on the line right now, but he has not paid for premium carriage, so you will have to wait for 10 seconds. If you would like to speak to Domino's, which has paid for premium carriage, press 1 now. Right? That's what a non-neutral network looks like. That's what a non-end-to-end network looks like. It's one in which protocols, services, and endpoints are restricted arbitrarily for commercial or policy reasons that essentially mean that carriers are not only permitted but encouraged to make money by deciding what services you should be allowed to see, as opposed to giving you the bits that you ask for as quickly and as efficiently as they can. I think it's really bad policy. Copyright is one of the major sources of justification for a non-neutral network. I mean, you may have heard Secretary of State Clinton a little while ago talking about the need to build censorship circumvention tools and deliver them all around the world. And she was like, well, we need to make tools that allow you to break out of firewalls that try to stop you from accessing information services unless they help you break out of firewalls that stop you from infringing copyright. I don't know how she proposes to make a firewall breaker that can tell whether or not you're intending to infringe copyright with it, but someone at the State Department, I guess, knows how to do that.
She also said that there should be no more anonymity on the web.
Well, she said everybody should be able to use anonymizing tools who doesn't live in America in order to access CNN, but there shouldn't be anonymity for people to say nasty things about the Secretary of State on the internet. I don't know. It was a contradiction wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in a soft floury tortilla for sure. So that's the hour. Shall I sit down somewhere and sign some books?
Let's
Is that
do
the
that.
plan?
Cory Doctorow.
Thank you.